Chapter 1. If the caravan didn't move soon, the twig digging into Nijat's back would make a hole. He lay in a thick clump of bracken by the road, not daring to move and feeling fairly certain that if he so much as scratched his nose, the caravan guide would spot him in an instant. She seemed to be the most sharp-eyed guide that ever roamed Azovia, and keeping his trail hidden from her had stretched his wilderness skills to the limit. The woman was from the western clans, as far as Nijat could surmise from her clothing. A pair of braids framed her face, blue and green threads twisted into them, blue on the right, green on the left, while the rest of her light brown hair flowed freely down her back. They were tracker braids, indicating that the best tracker of the Brannaden clan was guiding this particular caravan. Just my luck. Even now she swept her gaze toward the thicket where he lay, and he wished he could stop breathing altogether. "No, ma'am," she was saying patiently. "We cannot stop here for the night, no matter how saddle-sore you are. I can't see farther than a few yards in these woods. We need to camp somewhere more open for safety." "But—" It was the complaint-laden voice of the client now. Nijat couldn't see her from his angle, as she had dismounted and stood on the other side of her horse, but he had seen her often in the days he had been following this caravan. She was the spoiled daughter of a minor lord and wife to a rich merchant, and her voice was a constant whine that aggravated his patience, even after a few short days of eavesdropping. It must be far worse for the guide, and he admired her patient manner with her client. If their roles had been reversed, he didn't think he would have managed with as much equanimity. "But, Inessa," the client said, "I'm so tired, and these woods never seem to end. We really must stop here for the night. I can't go another minute longer." Nijat watched in interest as the guide, Inessa, handed her reins to a nearby footman and approached her client. "Lady Annalisa, you misunderstand me. When I say we cannot stop here for the night, I mean that you risk death. These woods are well known for bandits. If you insist on staying here, I will return your money and leave you to do it on your own. I am not going to die here because you are saddle-sore." She crossed her arms. "Do I make myself clear?" She apparently did. The client's reply was inaudible but chastened. She climbed back into her saddle, and the caravan, at last, moved on. Nijat breathed easier as they went around a bend and out of sight. He waited a moment longer, and then began extricating himself from the thicket. When he finally stood free of it and stretched his cramped muscles, scratches flecked his deep brown arms. A few paces behind the thicket, he picked up his quiver of 5-foot-long atlatl darts and carried them as he ducked and dodged his way through the tangled forest. 10 minutes later, he emerged from a blackberry thicket into a small clearing. Beside a picketed horse, a rumpled bundle lay on the ground. "Erhana, wake up!" He spoke in the Elvish language, his voice skipping up and down the scale of tones. The little oblong bundle twitched, and the tousled, curly, dark head of his 5-year-old sister popped out from under the folds of a large black cloak. Her blue eyes blinked up at him out of her dark-skinned face. "Hi, Nijat." Erhana sat back and rubbed her eyes with her tiny fists. "You were gone a long time. I got sleepy." She yawned. "Did you see or hear anyone?" She shook her head, making her curls dance. "Did you stay right here the whole time?" She nodded. "Good." He ruffled her hair with a smile. The light of her elven magic flickered wanly around his fingers, barely visible in the midday sun, matching the blue glimmers that danced in his own hair. They were elusive, easier to catch with a quick glance than with a steady gaze, like the flashes that spark from running your hand across a wool blanket on a dark night. It was the light of her Danao Vanadao, elven power given by the gods to guard life. Nijat straightened and looked around the clearing. "We'll stay here for the night and then turn north to the mountains. The woods get thinner closer to the river, so we can't keep following the caravan much farther anyway." She nodded, though he knew she understood little of what he said, and yawned again. "I'm hungry." Nijat reached for the saddlebag and brought out what remained of the bread he had stolen from the last farmhouse. He passed it to his sister and sat beside her as she munched and hummed a happy off-tune song through a half-filled mouth. His own belly ached, but he would wait until he could forage something else. He counted on his fingers. It was 7 days since he had last seen signs of their pursuers. By the mercy of the gods, it seemed that his bid to hide the marks of their journey within the trail of the caravan had worked, and if all remained quiet, they could turn north at last and go toward home in the mountains. He pulled his knees up to his chest and leaned his head on them wearily. "Nijat!" His sister poked him in the ribs. He looked up, blinking. He had nearly dozed off as he sat there. "Nijat, I want a story." He pushed his curly hair out of his eyes and ordered his thoughts again. "Do you want the one about Vaniki and the stolen staff?" "Yes." She licked the last crumbs off her fingers and nestled against him. "That's a good story." He put an arm around her and started. Long ago, in the days when the gods walked the mountains, and their dances tapped the rhythm of the New World's life song. A drop fell on his face, and he opened his eyes with a start. It was pitch dark. He must have fallen asleep after he finished the story, and slept for several hours. Erhana was curled up tight against his side for warmth. Another drop fell, and another. They needed to move to the shelter of the trees. He wrapped his cloak around Erhana and stood, bones creaking, to pull up the picket rope. But as he reached out, the hair on his arms prickled. Magic. He could feel it in the air. Unnatural sorcery, like a scream of metal in the distance, forced and ugly. It made his stomach churn. They were not far off then. Certainly too close to be a coincidence. He straightened and peered into the woods, straining his keen eyes. Then, with a swift motion, he picked up Erhana and mounted the horse with her. He wrapped the cloak around them as the horse started to move, carefully covering both their heads to hide their elven light. He put his hand on the horse's neck and whispered a word, his magic flickering brighter for an instant as the horse started forward. Erhana nodded sleepily on the saddle in front of him. It might be nothing, he thought, as he leaned over the back of the horse to avoid low-hanging branches. They were moving at a canter when they broke into another clearing, and Nijat glimpsed, near the far edge of the glade, the dim outline of the figure he had dreaded to see. A knight in black armour. He wheeled his horse hard to the right, back into the thick of the forest. Had he gone the wrong way? He was certain he had been moving away from the sorcery he had sensed back at the clearing. He wrapped one arm tighter around his sister and urged their horse faster. They were going parallel with the road, moving west, crashing through the underbrush as fast as the horse would go in the dark. Rain came harder, stinging his eyes and making it hard to see. The hood stuck to his forehead and dripped into his face. Then, coming to a thicket, his horse nearly collided with another. The knight on its back was terrifyingly near. Nijat drove his horse dangerously fast in the darkness and darted away from the gauntleted hand that reached out to hook his reins. The moment he was clear of the brush, he galloped for their lives, away to the left, farther from the road. He breathed hard with fear. The knights had surrounded them as he slept. How could he have been so careless as to fall asleep for so long? Gods of the mountain of my fathers, have mercy. Barely had the prayer passed through his mind when he saw yet another horseman riding parallel on his left. Nijat veered right toward the road, then realized they meant to herd him that way. He slowed his horse suddenly and darted to the left again, cutting behind the knight's mount and continuing on as the knight slowed to turn and follow. As the woods grew thinner, Nijat fled with less and less caution until they were at a full gallop. There was a large, sparsely forested hill ahead, the flat top of which offered a vantage over the trees. He could get his bearings there. It would also make him easier to spot, but he couldn't risk this deadly chase in the woods at full speed forever. When they crested the knoll, he pulled back on the reins and slowed to a walk, his horse blowing hard. Ahead was a collection of white tents barely visible in the rain about 2 miles off. The caravan's camp. If he went straight through it, would the riders fall back? After all, they wouldn't wish to be seen. He looked behind him. 3 riders were not far away in the trees below. No time for more strategy. He plunged on, aiming for the camp. He was gambling now, but it was all he could think of to put some distance between them. He had split the distance between himself and the tents when a 4th mounted knight broke from a stand of trees immediately on his right. Nijat wheeled to the left and narrowly avoided getting run down. As he pulled away, a sudden blow struck his right shoulder. A scream escaped him as a stabbing pain registered in his brain a moment later. He reached his left hand up and closed his fingers on the shaft of an arrow protruding from his shoulder. No, no, no! His mind raced, thinking of any way to get through this night alive and free, but options were dwindling quickly as the situation spun out of his control. Erhana started to wail, frightened by his cry. "Shh, Erhana, I'm fine. Stop worrying," he hissed to her, not knowing what else to say. Think, Nijat." 3 riders behind, 1 on his left. He veered right into a thicker area of forest. Then, turning in the saddle, he gripped Erhana as best he could with his weakened right hand and raised up his left. For a moment he simply held his hand skyward, sensing the rain and the wind that whirled in the column of sky above him. There! He found the edges of a finger-hold within the shape of the storm. His fist snapped shut around it, catching the wind like a cat's tail, and pulled down hard. The storm crashed earthward with blue lightning and a thunderous boom. The ground shook, and the smaller trees on either side of the knights crashed inward against them. Solid branches slapped against metal, and Nijat heard, with satisfaction, shouts and confusion above the roar of the wind. In the next instant, agony blazed through his body and took his breath away. He lurched forward, clutching desperately at Erhana so as not to drop her. White, frost-like trails were spreading down his right arm from his wounded shoulder, following his veins. His magic, which had been flickering freely over his skin in his panic, was feeble and shrinking. Poison. The arrow was poisoned against elven magic. I played right into what they wanted. His horse was slowing, pushed beyond its limits, but Nijat was in too much pain to think what to do. His body froze and burned. Every movement and jolt of the horse's hooves generated a new stab of shooting pain that stole his breath and blurred his vision. They entered a clearing as the moon broke through the clouds above them. Erhana was screaming, and he had no comfort for her. Mutely he held on as she twisted herself in the saddle, pulling at his clothes, wailing to know what was wrong. For the moment the knights were left behind them, but Erhana's cries would lead them straight to her. It was a matter of minutes until they were trapped again. A pale-skinned hand in the corner of his vision reached to catch the bridle of his horse. "Who's there?" he called, jerking upright despite the shock of pain that ran through him. "Let go of my horse, or I swear I'll—" "Inessa of Carver, at your service," a soft voice answered. "With whom do I have the pleasure?" "The caravan guide." She had a wool band around her chest, pulled up as a shawl over her head to protect from the rain that still fell. In her hand gleamed a naked dagger, but she held it defensively, not toward them. The sudden appearance of a kind stranger worked like a bucket of water dashed on his fractured wits. He stared dumbly, and then a single thought cohered. When he spoke again, he was pleading. "By Voro, help us! Take the child! They will be here any minute!" Inessa slid her hand along the horse's neck, cooing to the animal as she came toward him. The horse was flecked with foam from galloping, and quivered as Inessa walked beside it. She kept her dagger at the ready in her other hand, but her tone was gentle. "Show me." He moved awkwardly to pull the cloak back, but his right arm was paralyzed. In the effort he made, another wave of pain washed over him, and he fell forward with a cry. Inessa sheathed her dagger and put up a hand to steady him. "Easy there." She pulled his cloak back and grasped Erhana under the arms. "I've got the little one. You can let go." His arm relaxed. She lifted his sister down to stand on the ground. As soon as Erhana was out of the way, he let himself fall forward, his head on the gelding's neck. "Sir," Inessa touched his arm. "Where are you injured? Let me help you down. I can tend your wound." His breathing was ragged. "No, they'll be here any minute. Take her and go. I'll draw them off." "Where should I take her?" "Anywhere she'll be safe. Away from me," he answered between gritted teeth. "There's a western band camping south of here. I know them." Erhana clung to her leg and started to wail again in the darkness. She lifted her in her arms, shushing her. "Erhana." She looked up and quieted as she heard her name called. "This is really happening." Nijat pulled his hood back with fingers that shook. "My sister. The last time I'll see her little face. Neika nau maupada. Kisipapani kola kanaa." He spoke softly in musical Elvish. Erhana sniffled. "Aye." Nijat filled his whole heart with her image. Her big blue eyes wide with fear. Her black curls, flattened by rain, shimmered on her forehead. He turned his gaze to Inessa. "By the gods, protect her. Don't stop until she's safe. Go, run. They will be here any minute." He grit his teeth, summoned his strength, and sat up in the saddle. Pulling at the reins with his stronger hand, he wheeled the horse around and galloped into the woods. He had barely ridden a quarter-mile when his pursuers closed in again. The hooves thundered under and behind him. He didn't even try to keep his hood up to hide his light now. The ice in his veins constricted around his chest, keeping him from drawing a deep breath. Everything was a blur, and it was only a matter of time until consciousness failed him. His only goal was to draw them away from his sister. They were in thick woods, and then they were in an open plain, and then back in woods, and then back in the open, and then he was falling. The exhausted horse had run right off the edge of a ravine. He landed, looking up at the sky, the horse under him, the breath knocked out of him. The world spun, and he closed his eyes. The foremost thought in his mind was how strange it was for an elf to only manage to live 17 years. But if an elf was going to die young, it would definitely be him. It seemed the gods had abandoned him long ago. A warm gust of wind touched his face, and he opened his eyes. There, amid the spinning and the blur, a pair of massive wings flapped over him. Inessa took a deep breath and ran back into the trees in the other direction. Pausing in the shadows, she undid her wool band and wrapped it around the child. She wondered if she should go back to her camp, tell her client what had happened, and borrow her horse. But her client had her soldiers and attendants to care for, and Inessa worried that pursuers would be tracking the hoofbeats of any animal she rode. Better to go silently on foot, and soon, she thought. She had seen smoke signals from her clan camp earlier in the evening, so she knew that they had come to camp here, east of the Breca, as they did for a few weeks every year for the wild blueberry harvest. It was fortunate that they were close enough to reach on this wild night. They would be shocked to see her, and even more shocked by the elven child that she carried. The night returned to its calm as she walked. If she hadn't been holding the tattered child, she would have almost thought the whole exchange had been a dream. "I'm Inessa," she said in Azovian. "I won't hurt you." The little girl stared at her with big eyes. "I want Nijat," she whispered after a few minutes. Inessa nodded. "If he can meet us later, he will," she answered slowly, very aware that the stranger's wound had been severe. The child said no more. The rain had stopped, the wind picked up and blew the sweet scent of wet earth and fresh grass into her face. The clouds broke up and hurried away with the wind, and the stars appeared one by one. The girl in her arms whimpered at first before slowly quieting and falling asleep, her head resting on Inessa's shoulder. Inessa stole a glance from time to time at her and saw, deep in the matted tangles of dirty hair, the same flickers that her companion had. She had thought at first that her eyes were playing tricks on her when she had seen tiny flashes of light in the hair that framed his dark face. She had never seen elven sorcery before. Almost no one in Azovia had. But here in her arms was a tiny child who held the sorcery as well. How? She knew the child she held was too young to give answers. Topping her eyes, she paused to look down at the land, getting her bearings. Below her, the forest grew sparser, and eventually gave way to a savanna. Further on, it became the rolling, grassy hills of the clanlands, gleaming like silver in the moonlight. Just below her, Inessa saw the dark silhouette of a rider break from the trees, riding away to her right. She recognized the slumped figure of the man from before. His horse was tired and galloped slower as it crossed the open space. Just as he was about to disappear into another thicket of trees, two riders emerged behind him. Knights in black plate armour, dark and menacing. She ducked down behind a hillock and watched. They rode easily, hardly seeming to gallop, but yet covering ground at a chilling speed. A shiver of dread ran down her spine as she watched. Something was off. Something more than what she was seeing. The air she breathed stuck in her throat. Why did she feel as though evil eyes were raking the countryside, staring into her soul, though the knights looked straight ahead? She crouched lower until they had disappeared. "The gods be with that man," she whispered. In the wee hours of the morning, she entered the Brannadan camp and whistled to wake them. Her two older brothers stumbled out of the unmarried men's tent, bleary-eyed and startled to find her standing there with an unknown child. "I found another child in need of a family," Inessa said in Western dialect. "Just like I was." Her mother approached and looked under the folds of the band. "Who is she?" Erhana was what her companion called her. He was badly injured and still being pursued. Inessa set the child down and took away the wool band to let the others see the tiny flickers of her magic. There was a general murmur of shock from everyone who could see her. "An elf? But why?" Inessa shrugged. "I have no idea, but I imagine she needs the same care as a human." The child stared up at them with her huge, deeply blue eyes. "Get her some food, then. She's bound to be hungry." Her mother waved to her two older sons, sending them running to look for something the child could eat. She turned back to Erhana, but spoke to Inessa. "Is she alone, then?" she asked, crouching down and gently taking one of Erhana's tiny hands in her own. Inessa sighed. "I'll look for her companion in the morning, but I'm afraid—" She paused, not wanting to say her thoughts in front of the child, who knew which languages she may understand. "I'm afraid she is caught up in something dangerous, Mother. Keep her hidden." She turned as if to go, but her mother stopped her. "You'll come back and tell us more?" Inessa nodded. "When I can." She took another step, then hesitated, looking back at Erhana's eyes, so full of fear and questions. Crossing to her, she crouched down and switched to the Azovian language. "They're good folk, Erhana. They'll treat you kindly. You're not alone, and you're safe now." Inessa smiled at the child. "They were kind to me in the same way once."